Okay, so I want to give you a little more help on this particular problem. So the program starts right here. This is, where it's been repeated over and over, but the program actually starts right here. So we have 9 spaces, 1, 0 spaces, 1, 9 spaces. And then we come to the next line. So we have 8 spaces, a 1, 2 spaces, 1, 8 spaces. And you can put that into a spreadsheet. Looks like this. So the first step is you print 9 spaces, you print a 1, you print 0 spaces, and you print another 1, and then you print 9 spaces. So this would be your first loop through the void loop. So what you have to do is you have to have a counter on each loop. You can use the same counter because you're going to reset that. But you will need to specify the maximum value for the loop. And you're going to increment that. And you can see that this number here is going to be 10 minus the step number. So 10 minus 1 is 9, 10 minus 2 is 8, etc. And these are going to be this number minus 1 times 2. So 1 minus 1 is 0 times 2 is 0. 2 minus 1 is 2 minus 1 is 1 times 2 is 2. So that's how you can set the maximum values for each loop. So let's pull up my OneNote here. So you're going to have this. We'll call it counter k. That's the first one, and we're going to start at k equals 1. When k equals 1, we're going to then have these different maximum counters. So I'm going to call it J max. So J max is going to be equal to 10 minus 1. And then we'll have a loop, which will say for J equals 1 to J is equal to less than or equal to 10. I guess to 9. And then we'll have this J max. So that'll actually, we're going to set this equal to J max here. And then we'll increment the counter J equals J plus 1. And then inside here we have print, serial print, however that's formatted correctly. And then you'll have just quotation marks with a space in between. So that's not really, it's just a space. So what it'll do is every time it goes through a loop, it's going to print one more space. And it's going to go through this loop 9 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that'll print 9 spaces. And then you'll have your second bracket to match that up. So that what that does is it prints out 9 spaces. Then you're going to have, I guess it's a capital probably, isn't it? Serial dot print. And then you have in the parentheses 1, just the number 1. So that is to print this thing. Then you have the next loop. So we'll have this, we'll still use J max, but we'll redefine J max is going to be equal to, and this should be actually K. So it's 10 minus K. Here we have K minus 1 times 2. So what that does is it's going to calculate how many spaces we have here in the middle. So starting with k equals 1, we'll get 1 minus 1, which is 0, times 2 is 0. So we actually want to have the next for loop. Go j equals 1. J is going to be less than or equal to, say, j max. Well, if j max is 0, we start with j equals 1. It's just going to skip this step altogether. So it's never going to get beyond the first step. And that's good because we don't want anything in there. But we are still going to do this serial print because in subsequent loops, we still want to put these spaces in here like that. Like that. So for the first run through, we don't have any spaces because j max is going to be 0, and so this is never satisfied. It just skips over that one. And then you do your next one, like that, and then you have your third loop, which is really just like the first loop. So we just duplicate this thing. We will have to redefine j max again. So that's 10 minus k, which the first loop through, j max will be 9. And then we'd just have this same loop here. So then what it'll do is it'll print the next 9 spaces. Okay, so that does the first. That should, so you get your next loop in here. I'm trying not to do the whole thing for you. Then what you do is when you get to the whole thing at the bottom here, you can say k equals k plus 1. And then it'll loop back up to the beginning, and k will be 2. So j max in the first loop will be 10 minus 2, which will be 8. So it'll print 8 spaces. It'll print a 1. Then you'll have 2 minus 1, which is 1, times 2 is 2. So this thing will go through 2 times. It'll print 2 spaces in between. Then it'll print a 1. Then it'll print 8 spaces at the end. And then it'll just keep incrementing. So you'll keep going through this to get to this point. The question is, what do you do? How do you get it to go the other direction? How do you get it to change? Well, what you could do is you could actually have this number here you could say, let's see, what could you say? Instead of having a plus 1 here, you could have k dk, okay? And for the first loop through, dk is 1, so this thing adds. Then you might have an if statement that says if k is, after you've updated it, and if k is greater than 11, greater than or equal to 11, then what you do is you'd say dk equals -1. So what would happen is then, instead of adding 1, it would subtract 1. And so it would go the other direction. So then, instead of going this way, then it would go that way. K would start at 10, and then it would increment down to 1. And once it got to 0, then you could change dk to +1, and then it would go up. So you'd have to then have some other question here. If you got k was equal to 1, or 0 or something like that, then you would change decay back to +1. Now, unfortunately, I can't find my programming when I did it myself, so I don't remember exactly how I did it. So I'm going to still try to get you guys to do the rest of it. That's the basic idea here. Is you're going to have 3 loops. You're going to have this outside counter, which determines the maximum value for the loop. And the maximum value for the first loop will start at 9 and then go down to 0. For the middle loop will start at 0 and go to 18. And for the third loop will start at 9 and go down to 0. And if you can at least get this far, that'll be good. And then you can come up with some logic that'll make it so that it goes the opposite direction. I think that's what I did. Was I had some kind of logic statement here that made it so instead of increasing by incrementing by 1, +1, it incremented by -1. And then when I got to this point, where there was no space in here, then I started adding 1. And I got to this point and I subtracted 1 in my incrementing stuff.